Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this fantastic webinar. I am so excited that we are here tonight. Being your own best advocate means taking whatever you learn tonight to your provider. This is not medical advice. You know that. So just know that. This is not medical advice. We want to thank our sponsors, our incredible sponsors, which are Bayer, Johnson & Johnson, Novartis, Foundation Medicine, Myriad Genetics, Blue Earth Diagnostics, and Telix. We always appreciate the support that they provide, and they make this webinar possible. And we want to give a very special thanks to Illumina and Collaborative Cancer Care. Illumina provided one of our incredible speakers tonight, and I'm telling you, if you live in Connecticut, you are going to run after this webinar to Collaborative Cancer Care. They're incredible. Dr. Wendy, who you're going to see, oh my gosh, love her, amazing. So we want to give a big thank you to them. I will now hand this to our founder, Rick Davis, and he will kick us off tonight. Rick, take it away.
Well, once I can get my camera started, which should happen right now. Hello, everybody. It's good to be back introducing one of our fifth week webinars. Welcome. This is especially exciting because this is a webinar that is for everybody. It isn't just for the prostate cancer people or the pancreatic cancer people or the MS people, but all of you who attend ANCAN, participate in ANCAN, are touched by clinical trials. So we are going to try and give you a quick primer on clinical trials. If most of our examples are cancer related, that is because Dr. Marni her background is in cancer, an oncology nurse, and then a PhD researching cancer and a lot more. And that is also the background of our recently minted Dr. Wendy Garvin Mayo, who is now a doctor of nursing. So she's a little confusing. She's both a nurse and a doctor at the same time. I also want to give Wendy a special shout out because she's on our advisory board. And we are so grateful to her for all the many, many ways that she services ANCAN, our caregiver, especially our care partners, where she's been truly amazing in helping many of them and incredibly generous with her time. But now we're going to hone in on another area where she has a lot of expertise with clinical trials in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have one other advisory board member, Karen Peterson, who isn't here tonight, who is also specialized in diversity, equity, inclusion with clinical trials. So ANCAN does have a strong commitment in that area. So to Marni and Wendy, a huge, huge thank you. I should also add, I know Marni from her Foundation Medicine days, and that's where we first met. And this is not her first go around with us. Marni did a webinar for us 2 years ago, 3 years ago. I can't remember, but it was
yes.
It's a long time, yes. And the last person I want to acknowledge before I hand over to Marni, I think that's who I'm supposed to hand over to. Yes, that's lucky. Is I want to thank AlexaJet, who you just saw. This webinar could never, ever have happened without Miss Alexa. She has done an amazing job pulling it together, and we truly thank her. So, Marni, with that, over to you.
Excellent. All right, let me make sure I can share my slides. So can everyone see my slides first?
Yep.
Okay, excellent. So First, thank you so much, Rick and Alexa, for inviting me to do this. I always love working with Alexa and Rick, and so honored to be asked to come and speak again to all of you. I thought maybe I'd just introduce myself real quick, even though Rick already gave me a very nice introduction. Alexa mentioned, I'm from Illumina. I currently work there in oncology medical affairs. I have a PhD in pharmacology, but I'm also a nurse. So this has allowed me to take on a variety of different roles, particularly in oncology over the last 25 years. I kind of hate to admit that because it makes me feel old, but it's the truth. For one of those roles, I was very fortunate to work as a clinical trials coordinator at the UPMC Hillman Cancer Center in Pittsburgh, where I live. And it was there that I consented and enrolled and managed the care of women with breast cancer who participated in clinical trials there. So I also worked in Pittsburgh for an organization that developed and conducted clinical trials in breast and colon cancer. So all of this previous experience has made me very passionate about clinical trials and the patients and their families that are part of these clinical trials. And so I'm really excited to talk to you about this particular topic tonight. So I just wanted to show you some of the topics that I'm going to be going through, and I'm hoping that I'll be providing you with some facts and education as a clinical trials 101 discussion. So the focus will be mostly, as Rick said, oncology, cancer clinical trials. And the topics that I'll be highlighting, some of these are based on any type of clinical trial. So for example, the types and phases of clinical trials, what to expect during a clinical trial, and potential risks and benefits. You know, a lot of these are just common across clinical trials in general, whether they're cancer or not. But I'll also be giving you some examples of some pivotal cancer clinical trials and some common questions that come up about clinical trials themselves, and also questions that you may want to ask if you're considering being part of a clinical trial. And finally, we're going to end talking about a very important topic, which is the need for diversity in clinical trials. And I'm very excited to bring Wendy into that conversation so we can hear her expertise on this particular topic. So I just want to say that throughout this webinar, I really welcome everyone to stop and ask questions. As Alexa said, you can put questions into the chat. You know, I really want to make sure that I'm providing clarification, and I really encourage you to share anything that you like during the presentation. So please feel free to interrupt at any time. So I wanted to start just by general definitions. You know, if this is a clinical trials 101 discussion, then what is a clinical trial? So a clinical trial or a study, it's basically a research study that involves humans to explore whether a medical strategy or a treatment or a device is safe and effective to be used in humans. The biggest point I want to make tonight that I want all of you to take away from this is that participation in any clinical trial or study is voluntary. So that means you have the right to refuse treatment at any time. You have the right to stop participating in any trial at any time. And, you know, why are clinical trials conducted at all? What are the reasons for this? What are we looking to achieve? So we want to assist doctors and researchers in learning more about a particular disease. We want to improve healthcare and outcomes for people with these diseases in the future. We want to advance medicine and advance science. A big one is to find better treatment strategies. And a lot of times when people hear that, they immediately think new therapies that we need. And that's absolutely true. But a lot of times this could be different ways to use therapies that we already have. So maybe a combination of therapies that are already approved may work better than those therapies alone. Or we may want to study therapies in a new patient population. So if there is a therapy that's approved for adults, maybe that same therapy might work in pediatric patients. And finally, we want to provide access to new experimental treatments, particularly when there are no other options available. So I want to talk about the types of clinical trials. And you can see here, there's many different types. What I'm going to be focusing on the most in this particular conversation is treatment clinical trials. But let me go through some of the other examples so that you're aware. The first are prevention trials. And these are done, obviously, to prevent a disease in people, and particularly people who have never had the disease, or you're preventing it from returning or from getting worse. And so an example could be vaccines like the HIV vaccine, where again, we're trying to prevent people from getting the disease or maybe preventing people from having worse disease. There's screening trials. So that way we can test new ways to detect disease. So a good example of this is in prostate cancer, that prostate-specific antigen levels or PSA levels were studied originally and now being used to screen patients to be able to detect prostate cancer earlier. There are diagnostic clinical trials. So these study tests or procedures that can accurately diagnose disease. So an example of this for breast cancer, there is a particular subtype of breast cancer called HER2 positive. And the identification of the HER2 biomarker as a diagnostic approach is a way to be able to know that a patient with HER2 positive breast cancer can receive certain types of therapies and may have a different prognosis than other types of breast cancer. I mentioned treatment trials, which is what we're going to be focusing on the most. And these will test new therapeutic approaches. And these aren't just drug trials. These are also trials to test different surgical procedures or different radiation techniques. And an example is for non-small cell lung cancer patients, where it's been discovered that for particular biomarkers identified in patient tumors, that there are targeted therapies that can treat those specific tumors that have those biomarkers. Behavioral trials are evaluating behavioral changes to improve health. So we are all aware that smoking can cause many different types of cancer. So a behavior trial would be looking at smoking cessation and how that can prevent different cancers. And then finally, quality of life. So these are really important trials that are examining ways to improve the comfort and the quality of life of people who have these particular illnesses. And so there may be a trial where they're looking at the long-term negative effects of a particular therapy and ways that people are coping with these particular side effects and ways that they can be potentially relieved. So these are all different types of clinical trials, but what about the phases of clinical trials? And some of you may be familiar with these or have heard of these different phases. I wanted to summarize them here to give you a better understanding of the purpose and what's involved in each phase. So if your approach to participate in a clinical trial, it will be designed and conducted within one of these phases. Phase 1 is all about establishing the safe use of a particular treatment. So these trials are typically based on using a treatment for the first time in humans. Researchers want to determine potential side effects that may be present, as well as establish the safest dose where they expect the treatment to be effective and cause the least amount of side effects. These are often the smaller studies, so there's about 20 to 100 people that will participate, and they typically last for less than a year. For the phase 2 studies, researchers continue to monitor the safety of the particular treatment, but they're now examining for the effectiveness of that treatment across a larger number of participants. So this is about 100 to 300 people that may participate. And it will be conducted anywhere from a few months to around 2 years. When the goal of a study is to obtain approval of a new drug therapy, the FDA can grant what is called accelerated approval of a therapy after a phase 2 trial if the drug has been shown to be effective in patients that have a serious condition like advanced cancer. So an example would be a drug showing effectiveness in a particular cancer that traditionally has been difficult to treat, and new and more effective treatments are urgently needed. However, if it does receive that accelerated approval, the effectiveness of that therapy still needs to be proved in a phase 3 trial in order to receive full FDA approval. So in a phase 3 trial, the therapy is examined in a much larger population, so anywhere from 300 to 3,000 people, and it's often compared with the standard of care that's already approved for these patients. And this is to confirm effectiveness and further monitor safety and side effects. So these trials take longer to conduct. I have here that it can be between 1 to 4 years, but sometimes these trials can go on for 10 years, depending on the type of cancer. And if it's proven that this experimental treatment is more effective or similarly effective as standard of care treatment, and there's tolerable side effects, the drug can receive full FDA approval at that time. So full FDA approval of a therapy can only happen after a phase 3 trial has been completed. In phase 4, which is the final phase, the approved therapy is now available to be prescribed for patients, and the safety and effectiveness is continued to be monitored over a long period of time to determine if there's any long-term safety concerns. And this is typically looked at over thousands of patients at that time. So I wanted to provide you with some of the key terms that you also probably can hear a lot when it comes to clinical trials and protocols. So I'm sure that most people on this call have heard the term placebo, but I believe there's a lot of misconceptions of what it means to be on a trial where a placebo is being used. So the definition of placebo is what you expect. It's a product that looks like the new treatment being tested, but it does not have any therapeutic value. So if you are part of a trial where a placebo is being used, the patients receiving the placebo always receive the standard of care. And this is the care that they would normally receive, whether they were on the trial or not. So patients in any trial will always receive what the standard of care is for their particular clinical situation, as patients are never put at risk when they are enrolled on trials. There are only a small number of cancer clinical trials that use placebos. And if you were to be on a trial that used a placebo, you will be informed prior to entering that trial. Now, in some of these studies, the patients who receive the placebo may be eligible to receive the new experimental therapy later on if that therapy has been proven to be more effective than the standard of care alone. Now, some of you may also have heard of the term randomization. So in a randomized trial, patients that are enrolled are randomly assigned to receive the treatments that are being compared rather than being assigned by choice. So I've added here that the reason randomization is necessary is some trials, they're trying to prevent bias in that if you assign patients, you are not biasing patients to one treatment or another. So we just talked about trials with placebos. So often these trials are randomized to make sure we have enough participants receiving placebo versus the experimental therapy, so that this is not based on the patient or the provider's preference of being on the placebo or not. And if we see that one treatment that was assigned is much more effective than the other, then the trial will be stopped to allow all patients to receive the most effective therapy. So I'll be showing you an example of a randomized trial a little later on, but keep in mind that most phase 3 and some phase 2 trials are randomized. And then finally, a blinded study means that when more than one therapy is part of a study, the patients and or the researchers do not know what therapy they received. So single-blinded means the patients do not know what they're receiving, but the researchers are aware. And in a double-blinded study, participants and researchers are not aware of who is receiving that particular treatment. The reason for conducting these types of studies is, again, to avoid bias or influencing the results of the trial. So if I use that placebo example again, side effects that are reported by the patient or the providers may be different if either are aware of the therapy that they are receiving, which can affect the results. Okay, so that was the background pretty much on clinical trials. Before I move on to the next topic, are there any questions in the chat, Alexa, or any questions that people want to ask?
We have so many questions. We'll do that at the Q&A because they're so good. Just keep going. This is so good.
All right. Sounds good. Okay. So I guess we'll move on then. So we're going to talk a bit about what you can expect when you are participating in a clinical trial. And so what I did is I separated this out in terms of the process and procedures that occur prior to being enrolled in a trial and what happens after you're enrolled. So before you're approached about a clinical trial, your doctor and their staff will pre-screen individual patients to determine if they meet the general eligibility requirements for trials that are being conducted where you're receiving your treatment. So the pre-enrollment and post-enrollment processes are usually managed by a clinical trial coordinator. Again, I was very fortunate to be able to be one of these people. And so a clinical trial coordinator, they also can call them CRC or clinical research coordinator. When they're involved in pre-screening, the patient-specific information is reviewed to determine if a trial is open that they may be eligible to participate in, which usually includes things like the type of cancer, the stage of the cancer, a patient's age. And if the basic criteria are met, your doctor and a clinical trial coordinator will approach you with an informed consent form. These can be rather lengthy documents, and they explain the clinical trial in detail. And I've listed some of those details here, and this is not all of them, but some of the ones that I've listed include the purpose of the trial, all the procedures and tests that will be performed, what is paid for by the study versus what you will be responsible to pay for through your insurance. And you have the right to take this consent form home, to take your time to review it, as much time as you need, because as I said, this can be a lengthy document and you want to be sure you are fully understanding what this trial is and what your responsibilities are. If you agree to participate in the study, you must sign this consent form that acknowledges that you understand the information that was provided. Now, signing this form does not guarantee that you will be part of the study. The clinical trial staff then continues the process of determining whether you are fully meeting the eligibility requirements to take part in the trial. So they'll review your medical records and they'll schedule any additional tests or procedures that are needed to determine if you meet all eligibility requirements for that trial. If even one eligibility criteria is not met, you will be informed that you cannot participate. So this extensive screening process is in place because it ensures that it is safe for the patient to be part of the trial and ensures that the data collected for the trial is accurate. So now if you met all of those eligibility requirements, you'll be enrolled into the trial and the coordinator will assist with managing your care while you're participating. So what I'm showing you here is a simple example, believe it or not, simple example of a schedule that a coordinator will refer to that will be part of that trial and specific to that trial. So in order for any patient to remain part of the trial, this schedule must be adhered to with no exceptions. So I just mentioned the screening process prior to enrollment. You see here that all assessments, tests, and procedures for screening must occur within 14 days prior to enrollment. So for example, if we look at the CT scan all the way at the bottom there on the table, it is required to have a CT scan within 14 days prior to enrollment. This means if you had a CT scan 4 weeks ago, it will not be valid for the trial. And so another CT scan will have to be scheduled to meet that requirement. During the study, a CT scan is performed at the end of cycle 2 of receiving that medication. The coordinator will schedule this CT scan for you to meet this requirement. If the scan is not completed on time, this would result in you being removed from the study. So I'm showing you this because these schedules must be adhered to in order to conduct the trial, and the coordinator will be there to schedule appointments and remind you of what needs to happen and when. They may also call you as part of this schedule to ask you about any side effects you may be experiencing, and you can call them directly to report any side effects. Throughout the study, the coordinator, the physicians, and other staff will be closely monitoring you and managing all of your care to ensure your safety and to keep you on track with the protocol requirements. So now I wanted to move on to some potential risks and benefits when you are in a clinical trial, and some of these may be obvious, but others may not be. So if the trial involves an experimental treatment, the benefit is that you have access to this new treatment before anyone else, and it could be effective in treating your disease. But of course, the risk is that it may not be effective, and it may not be effective for you, or it may not be effective for anyone that's part of the trial. And because it's experimental, you may experience side effects due to this therapy. You also will likely need additional tests and procedures as part of the study that also have their own risks. But the benefit is that your healthcare is being managed by a dedicated, specialized team of providers that will be closely monitoring you to help manage any side effects and help you to schedule and keep track of all appointments, tests, and anything else that's related to the study. We also talked about placebos and receiving standard of care treatments instead of the experimental treatment. This risk is not a risk to your safety necessarily because you're receiving the same treatment you would be receiving if you were not part of the study, but you're risking not being assigned to receive the experimental therapy, and you may be more interested in that. And finally, the overall benefit of participating in a clinical trial is you're contributing to advancing science and medicine by helping researchers learn more about your disease and helping others by discovering new ways to treat your disease. I wanted to quickly share a personal story on this that has to do with my cousin Jen. So my cousin Jen was diagnosed 4 years ago at the age of 42 with advanced ovarian cancer. She had been through multiple standard treatments that had worked for her for a while, but her disease was continuing to progress. And she was approached to participate in a clinical trial using a new combination of therapies for her disease. She was really excited to be part of this trial, even though she knew there was a risk that this therapy combination may not work for her. She was excited because she wanted to help other ovarian cancer patients in the future to better understand the disease and hopefully find better treatments. She ended up being called a super responder in that her tumors shrunk by 60% while she was part of this study. And the researchers were so excited by her response, they had collected additional blood specimens and tissue specimens from her tumor so that they could really look at why she responded so well. And that information can potentially identify patients in the future that may respond well. So this made Jen ecstatic and extremely happy, even though she eventually progressed and had to be taken off of these particular therapies. But her participation ended up benefiting her and potentially other patients in the future. So I just wanted to run through some pivotal clinical trials that have occurred. And this first example is trials that were conducted in early stage breast cancer patients. And this was way back, so starting in the early 70s when these trials were conducted. So years ago, and we're talking, way beyond the 70s, women, when they were diagnosed with early stage breast cancer, when they received surgery, received these radical mastectomies. These particular surgeries were extensive and pretty horrific for these women to go through. They not only were removing the breast tissue and any lymph nodes, but they removed all of the lymph nodes and they removed the entire chest wall that was near the breast. So this was a very intense surgery that these women had to go through. And so that led to a trial called the NSABP B4 trial that was started in the early 70s, where these women with early stage breast cancer, they asked the question, could they receive less surgery? So could we do a modified radical mastectomy where we would still remove the breast and lymph nodes that were affected, and not remove all of the lymph nodes and not remove the entire chest wall? And what they found from this study was that women had much better outcomes when they had this less extensive surgery and these not these radical mastectomies, but these modified radical mastectomies. And so then they asked the question, can we do even less surgery and spare these women from losing their breasts altogether? And so they did this NSABP B6 trial. And there were several trials after that showed the same types of results, where women, if they had a small enough tumor, could receive a lumpectomy Instead, where just the tumor itself was removed from the breast, and if there were positive nodes, those nodes were removed as well. And they were able to show that this minimal surgery was just as effective as having a modified radical mastectomy, as long as those patients also received radiation as well. So these were pivotal studies that completely changed how breast cancer is treated when it comes to surgery, and has spared many, many women from having these extensive surgeries. This is an example of a chemotherapy trial in colon cancer. So this is a phase 3 trial, and it's an example of a randomized trial. So early stage colon cancer patients were to receive chemotherapy after their surgery. And this was to study the types of chemotherapy that would be most effective after these patients had their surgery. So if they met the eligibility criteria, they were then randomized to receive either 2 of these chemotherapies or 3 of these therapies in combination. And what they found was the combination of all 3 of these chemotherapies were the most effective in the treatment of colon cancer after surgery. I also wanted to give you some examples of what clinical trials are when they're focused on precision medicine. And so I first wanted to just kind of define for you what precision medicine is. So on the left-hand side is a one-size-fits-all approach. So that means the example I just gave of chemotherapy. So this here is showing lung cancer patients. So when chemotherapy is given to lung cancer patients, it's given to all patients, regardless of any differences there may be in their particular tumors, and it's used to treat those patients overall in a one-size-fits-all approach. Whereas in precision medicine, we're basically using treatments that are individualized for that patient's particular cancer. And it's based on identifying a particular biomarker in the patient's tumor that's driving that cancer. So if we sequence those tumors and look at their DNA and find a particular mutation, then that is a very specific treatment approach that we're going to give that patient that's going to target that specific mutation and those specific tumors. So this is showing you some advancements that have occurred in precision medicine over the last 20 years. And it started way back in the 70s, where they identified the estrogen receptor for breast cancer patients, and that tumors that had an abundance of the estrogen receptor responded to a targeted therapy called tamoxifen. And then later on in the 2000s, they started to identify new biomarkers in different cancers. So EGFR and KRAS and BRAF were discovered in lung cancer, in colon cancer, in melanoma. And there were targeted therapies developed for these particular biomarkers to specifically target the tumors and kill the tumors. And then later on down the line in 2010 and beyond, we started to see the approvals of immunotherapies and biomarkers that can allow for immunotherapies typically are called pan-tumor biomarkers. So that means that it doesn't matter what type of cancer you have. If you have this particular biomarker in your tumor, you can receive that particular targeted therapy. So one example you see here is this NTRK fusion in 2018. So this is a particular biomarker that, again, no matter what cancer you have, if you have that biomarker, you can receive this targeted therapy called larotrectinib. And there have been many, many more discoveries of new biomarkers and approvals of targeted therapies well beyond 2020. So there are a number of biomarker-linked clinical trials that are out there now. When we looked in 2023, we looked across all cancer types and found that there were almost 5,000 clinical trials across all cancer types where they were linked to at least one type of biomarker for looking for, targeted therapies. For lung cancer specifically, we found 310 active trials that were linked to biomarkers within lung cancer. For lung cancer itself, they call lung cancer the poster child for precision medicine, because the first targeted therapy developed for lung cancer based on a biomarker was back in 2003, where when patients' tumors were found to have a mutation in the EGFR gene, these patients responded to particular targeted therapies that were developed to target that particular gene mutation, and they saw significant responses. Before that, chemotherapy was the only option. And sadly, when patients that had metastatic lung cancer received chemotherapy, they did not have a long survival. It was less than a year. But now with these targeted therapies and precision medicine, we are seeing patients live for many years with metastatic disease. And an example I can give you is a personal example of my uncle. My uncle was diagnosed with metastatic lung cancer over 4 years ago. And his tumor was found to have one of these EGFR mutations. And there are now several targeted therapies for EGFR mutations. He received one of those, and he is still on that same targeted therapy. He is living a very active life. He travels, and he's very happy. So I am incredibly grateful that this option was available for him. So overall, what the point I want to make is that when it comes to precision oncology trials, these particular targeted therapies wouldn't exist if it wasn't for participants being part of these trials to discover these new therapies. And in order to be part of a precision oncology trial, you have to have biomarker testing. If you don't, then you won't know if you have a particular gene mutation, and then you will not be part of one of these trials if it's something that you desire. And I just wanted to show you an example of how effective some of these therapies can be. And this is the example I mentioned earlier about the NTRK fusion biomarker. And this particular biomarker, again, is a pan-tumor biomarker. So all of the colors that you see represent an individual patient response, and the color is the type of cancer that they had. So all of these cancer types were studied because all of these patients had the NTRK fusion in their tumor. And this is called a waterfall plot. So what it means is that all of the lines that are below the horizontal line, so all of these lines that are going into the negative numbers, are showing responses. It's showing a change in tumor size, basically shrinking of the tumors. So many of these patients across all these different cancers responded to this targeted therapy because their tumor had this particular biomarker.
Hey, Marni, for some reason, your screen's a little blurry. Can you try to switch your slides a little bit? Because we can't fully see the slide for some reason.
Oh, okay. Did that make any difference?
For some reason, it's stuck on like the waterfall slide. The other slide was fine. Like that. Okay, there we go. And now we can see it. Thank you.
Is it better? Okay.
Yeah,
Sorry
thank
about
you.
that.
No,
That's
you're
really
good.
strange. Yeah. Okay. So, yeah. So now you might be able to see the different lines and the different colors. Sorry about that. But I like to show this particular data because, you know, a therapy attached to a biomarker like this is pretty incredible in terms of response. Keep in mind, though, that this particular biomarker is actually not found very frequently across many different tumor types. So again, this is why you need to have biomarker testing to see if this biomarker is present. And the reason I brought up that frequency is because these types of precision medicine trials need to have a different approach in order to find new biomarkers and new targeted therapies. So I'm showing you here two different approaches to these types of trials. There are umbrella trials, which means there's one particular cancer type. So let's say lung cancer, and we're looking at different biomarkers within lung cancer itself. And so each biomarker, we're going to study a different targeted therapy that will target each one of these biomarkers. So 3 different biomarkers, 3 different therapies, 1 cancer. The difference is a basket trial where you have multiple cancer types and you're looking at one single biomarker. So you have a lot of different cancers, one marker, like the NTRK example I just showed you, and then you're testing one targeted therapy against that biomarker across multiple cancers. So there's a little bit different approach than the standard trials that I was talking about previously. Skip over that. And so I wanted to get to the common questions regarding clinical trials. And this may not be all of the questions that you were thinking about, but these are some of the more common ones that I heard when I was in the clinic and what I continue to hear from people who approach me and ask me questions about clinical trials. So the first 2, I think, are really important questions, but also really difficult to answer. So is a clinical trial the right choice for me? And how does a clinical trial affect my family? So this is a very personal question. And it's going to be, the answer is going to be based on your personal experiences. It will be based on your own values, what your goals are for your treatment. That how it affects your family is going to be based on your own personal dynamics with your family. But an example I can give you of a trial that may directly impact you and your family could be a trial that's studying your risk and the risk of your family members being diagnosed with a cancer that's based on a hereditary gene mutation. So a gene mutation that's been inherited throughout your family, studying that particular mutation in a trial to see what those risks are would obviously directly impact you and your family. But keep in mind that choosing to be on a clinical trial can impact your family in other ways. So if there are particular side effects that are not side effects that they're difficult for you to manage, they're causing difficulties for you to be interacting with your family members, of course, that can affect your family in those ways. Or the types of procedures you need to receive and the timing of those. You may need to coordinate with your family for rides or other aspects of that. So there's a lot of different ways, but it can also affect your family in a lot of positive ways. If it's a trial where the medication has allowed you to be able to have an extended time with your family, such as my uncle, that's a very positive outcome for the whole family. because we now have more time with him and more quality time. When it comes to safety and privacy in a trial, there's several processes that ensure that the trial is in compliance with ethical guidelines. The process of informed consent that I mentioned earlier informs you of all details and aspects of that trial, and that includes the risks and benefits. The informed consent form will also provide details on privacy and confidentiality of your personal information, and that would include the HIPAA privacy rule. Most research trials are carefully reviewed and approved by an IRB, or an institutional review board, and this is done prior to opening the trial for enrollment. An IRB is a committee that's typically made up of doctors, data analysis teams, and members of the community. And this is to ensure the trial is ethical and participant rights are protected. There are data and safety monitoring boards, and these are usually involved in phase 3 trials. They're there to review the progress of the trial and monitor the safety of the patients. And these typically are made up, again, of doctors, data analysts, and other clinical trial experts to ensure, again, the accuracy and integrity of the data. This board can stop a trial early if there's a safety concern, or they could stop the trial if the particular therapy that's being studied is highly effective, because this would allow patients outside of the study to receive the therapy faster. And there's also other organizations that provide protections for research and guidance for conducting clinical trials, such as the Office for Human Research Protections. Now, when it said, why would I be removed from participating in a clinical trial? There's actually several reasons you could be removed. And as a reminder, I said in the beginning, you have the right to withdraw yourself from a trial at any time. But you can be removed from a trial by your healthcare providers or the researchers that are conducting the study for several reasons. For example, if you're experiencing side effects that are difficult to manage, or it may be dangerous to your overall health. You could be removed if your disease progresses, because that means that the therapy is no longer working for your particular disease. If the trial ends early, it could be due to a safety concern, or that the therapy is highly effective, as I just mentioned, and so that the trial would end and you would obviously not be on the trial anymore. Or you could be removed if you continue to not comply with the requirements of that particular trial. So for example, if you miss several appointments that are necessary to gather data and ensure your safety, then they will not want you to continue on that particular trial. Can I find out what the results are from the trial? So when a trial is completed, the data is carefully analyzed by researchers and they draw conclusions. The researchers may decide to move on to the next phase or to stop studies that, involving that treatment due to safety concerns or that the treatment was not effective. So whether or not a trial is considered positive, meaning the treatment was effective and safe, or negative, where there were safety or efficacy concerns, the results are presented at scientific and medical conferences, and they're published in scientific journals. So you can ask the study team if the results have been presented or published so you could see the outcomes of the trial. And patient advocacy groups, they're well versed in the latest research and data that's been presented. And they also would have a good idea of what that latest data is and for a particular clinical trial. You can find out about clinical trials that are available to you by talking to your doctors and other healthcare providers. You can also speak to someone who works in clinical trials, like a clinical trial coordinator. If you receive biomarker testing, the report that is sent to the doctor will actually have a list of clinical trials that are available based on that particular biomarker if it's present in your tumor. You can look at websites like clinicaltrials.gov and you can search for key terms. However, I just want you to keep in mind that if you're searching for clinical trials online, that the eligibility criteria are very complex. And so you may think that you could be part of that particular trial, but in essence, with all of that eligibility criteria, you might not be. And so it's better to consult with your physicians, with your other healthcare providers to really be able to determine what trials are available to you. And finally, you could hear of a trial for a particular therapy on a website, on a commercial, and you could actually, go to that particular sponsor's website. Usually it's a pharmaceutical company, or you can actually contact the primary investigator of the particular study for more information. And finally, does the clinical trial pay for my healthcare? This is also a really difficult question to approach because it really depends on the study and your insurance. So overall, the general rule is that a clinical trial will pay for anything that is specific to the trial and is not part of your standard care. If you want to know the exact costs that you will be responsible for anything that goes through your insurance, I always recommend that you talk to someone in billing at your particular institution because they can go step by step through everything and tell you what is paid for, what is not, and co-pays and everything that has to do with your individual insurance. And here I'm just listing several questions that you would want to ask when participating in a trial. This includes, what's the purpose? What are my responsibilities? What are the therapies, procedures, and tests you'll receive? You may want to ask what other options are available if you don't be part of the trial. What are the possible short and long-term risks and benefits? Because there could be risks that, for example, a particular treatment that may have a side effect that lingers for a long period of time. So you may want to ask about those types of things. Who will be part of your care overall? Will you just be seeing your oncologist, or will you have to see other doctors? Will you have to go to other clinics for particular treatments? Will I have to pay for anything in the trial? We just talked about that. And who do I contact with any questions or concerns I have in the trial? Those contacts will be listed in every consent form that you would sign. So finally, to the last topic, I apologize.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. I had a question that came in, and I really want to answer it just real quick because it's kind of the subject that we're talking about. Somebody asked, when you're signing the consent forms, does somebody explain to the patient what they're signing?
100%.
Okay.
So
okay.
That is essential. So if you are ever given a consent form and you have not had a doctor and or a clinical trial coordinator go through that consent form with you and explain it in detail with you, then you should not sign any consent form. That is the entire purpose of informed consent, is that you should be given the ability to not only review it yourself, but review it with a healthcare provider so that you can ask essential questions before you sign anything. And again, remember, even if you signed the consent and you felt, oh, wait, I didn't understand that fully, or wait, I forgot about this particular thing. Again, it doesn't matter. If you change your mind after you sign the consent form, that is absolutely fine. You can take yourself off at any point.
Perfect. Yes. I wanted to make sure because that's such a great question. I could understand how someone could think that you're handed this document that, you're making a huge decision and there's so many things you don't understand. So that's really important.
Yes, absolutely. And I wanted to get to this important topic so that I can bring Wendy into this conversation, because this is the need for diversity in clinical trials. And I'm gonna end on this slide so that we can talk about this in more detail. I liked this slide because I really liked the wheel on the left-hand side, because it really showed all of these different populations of people. And really, these populations are who we need more of in clinical trials in general. The reason being is that different populations may respond differently to medications or treatments. They may experience different types of side effects. A particular group of individuals may be found to have a higher risk of developing a certain cancer. And so screening preventions would need to be altered to fit that particular group. There's so many differences that you can see in different populations. And unfortunately, a lot of the reasons why we don't have diversity in clinical trials, some of it, or a lot of it, is due to trust, or what I really should say, mistrust. In order to trust in clinical research, a participant needs to believe that the study itself is not above the participant's particular interests. So, for example, participants want full disclosure. They want to know that there's a balance of risk versus benefit. They want to make sure that the data is being used properly. And unfortunately, mistrust in research stems from horrific historical events where there was deception, there was mistreatment of patients, basically unethical medical research. And so because of that, we have a lot of work to do to build trust back. There's also, we have a lack of diversity in trials because of racism and discrimination and unconscious bias. So examples, healthcare providers, they may not approach non-white individuals or older individuals because they feel that they would not want to be part of a clinical trial or interested in a clinical trial. That's an unconscious bias. That is absolutely not necessarily the case. There's language barriers. If you don't have consent forms in multiple languages, or you don't have interpreters that can be there to help explain those informed consent forms, then you're not going to have different populations as part of these trials. Even where those trials are conducted. So urban community hospitals could have a high number of patients with lower socioeconomic status. And those community hospitals may suffer from not having the funding or the resources to conduct these clinical trials. So this will significantly limit patient access to trials that may only be available at these larger academic hospitals. So all of these things need to be taken into account to provide greater access to these trials for all diverse populations. And again, we really need to increase the trust in communities. We need to build trusting relationships. We need to increase funding and provide resources for not just patient education, but educating healthcare providers. Because again, I mentioned unconscious bias. Healthcare providers need to understand where that bias can be. So overall, just establishing better systems, better infrastructures for clinical trials, all of these things can potentially help to make clinical trials more diverse. And there are ongoing efforts to address disparities and provide equal access to care. And it remains a high priority for many clinical research organizations, health systems, and even the government. And so I want to bring Wendy into this now because I would love to hear her thoughts on this important topic and some of her experience in this.
Yes, thank you so much. This was an amazing presentation, and I think every patient should really hear this presentation because you cleared up so many misconceptions out there in the communities, especially with placebo. That one was really key that many patients need to hear, and the mutations. Many trials are specific for mutations, and then mutations are more prevalent in certain ethnic groups. And if those ethnic groups are not represented, we don't know if the drug will be effective or even safe. So, thank you so much for that. This presentation, it's wonderful.
You mentioned about the biomarkers and that was one additional slide that I had. I'm glad that you brought that up because this is a great example. I mentioned earlier back in 2003, that's when the first targeted therapy was approved for patients with non-small cell lung cancer. And those initial trials, when they gave that particular therapy, the interesting thing is they had a great response, particularly in Asian patients, and they didn't know why. And so when they went on to do further research and looked at the tumor specimens of patients across different races and sequenced those tumors, you see in the middle that a large number of patients with lung cancer have EGFR mutations. But you see that the highest frequency is actually in Asian patients and Hispanic or Latino patients. So that explains why Asian patients responded so well to that therapy because they had a lot of EGFR mutations. And so this goes to Wendy's point that we need to make sure that all patients are being tested for biomarkers. It does not matter what your race are. It's highly important that everyone receives this because they could be receiving life-changing targeted therapies. And you're only going to know that if you get testing done.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned a couple of things regarding the reason that different diverse populations don't participate in trials, which, mistrust is definitely one, biases, access is another one. Do patients have access to clinical trials? And more recently, there's some data that showed that many patients did not even ask about it wasn't even an option. So if they knew about it, they would have definitely, enrolled in a clinical trial. So I think what we're doing here tonight is very important for a number of reasons. And I think, Alexa mentioned it at the very beginning. It's really advocacy. And the way you can effectively advocate for yourself and others is through education. And when you have education, you can go and advocate for what you are supposed to receive or advocate for information. And I have really been on the mission to empower patients to really part of their care, including clinical trials. If you have a diagnosis of prostate cancer, breast cancer, myeloma, whatever it is, you start the conversation. Many times we put that power in the hand of the healthcare professional, and we can't do that anymore. We really can't do that. And I love Ann Canrick, what you're doing for patient advocacy, because you don't have to do it alone. You don't have to do it alone. You can, join forces with an advocacy group, with individuals like myself, who's an advocate, with Marni, who's an advocate, and we can help you. You don't have to do it alone. I think many times patients feel like they have to do it alone. But we increase diversity in clinical trials. It's important for the trajectory of, treatment landscape of oncology. So yes, this is such a great webinar. Marni
So are we ready to answer some
How
questions?
is your organization?
Oh, I'm so sorry, Wendy.
Am I not coming through? I'm
No,
sorry.
you're not. I'm sorry, you were silent.
Yeah, sorry, Wendy, you broke up a little bit. So I can you repeat what you just asked?
Yes, go ahead, Wendy. Here.
I was asking Marni, how's your organization addressing diversity in clinical trials? Because I know a lot of sponsors have different initiatives to help increase diversity in clinical trials.
So the way that we're approaching it right now is education. So, and
Mhm.
being part of medical affairs, that is one of our biggest goals. And again, I mentioned it's not just about education of the patients, it's education of the healthcare providers. That is really key to make sure that we are getting access for everyone. And again, that doesn't just mean access for clinical trials, but that also means access for testing to be part of
Mm-hmm.
a clinical trial. So, this is something else that we've discovered over time is that there is not equal access for biomarker testing. And there's a lot of reasons for this that are very similar to the clinical trials aspect. But another part of this, and one of the things we've been working on a lot, is working with the insurance companies themselves, because a lot of insurance companies have policies that do not allow access for all patients. So they're not reimbursing for testing across the board. And so we're working very hard to change the way that these insurance policies are written to make sure that all patients can have access to testing, and therefore they would have access to any clinical trial that involves testing as well.
Yeah, I would also add the education of the care partners they're a big part of this whole clinical trial journey for cancer patients. They also need education as well as our advocacy groups because they're out there educating the community. So that's wonderful that your organization is doing that. All right, Alexa, do you have questions for us?
I have so many questions and I'm very excited. I will say, if you come to our groups at ANCAN, we always talk about get sequenced. So I'm very glad, Marnie, that you touched on that and how important that is, because you will hear it from Rick, you will hear it from me. It's very, very important. Yes, we have so many fantastic questions. One of the questions that I wanted to get to is, can you, one or either of you, touch on kind of, someone asked about right to try or compassionate use? Kind of, when is that appropriate? Is that involved in a trial? Like, kind of what that is.
Wendy, I can take a stab at it first, and do you want me to, and then you can chime in? Or
Sure.
the only reason I offered to chime in first is because I actually I've not only been involved in this with patients, but also with a very close friend of mine. Compassionate use is not within a clinical trial itself.
Mm-hmm.
So compassionate use is typically a drug that is not yet approved for that particular cancer type or a particular biomarker that we were talking about. But a patient has already received all the potential therapies that are available to them, and the doctor believes from some data that is out there that this patient could respond. And so they are approaching a pharmaceutical company to say, there is some limited data to demonstrate that my patient might respond to this therapy. I'd like to get this therapy for compassionate use for this particular patient. This happened with a friend of mine who had sarcoma. He had metastatic sarcoma and had already had all potential treatments available to him. and his disease was continuing to progress. There was some limited data for immunotherapies that might work in his type of sarcoma. Again, limited data. The doctor approached my friend with this option, and he was very young. He was only 33 and wanted the opportunity to live as long as he could. And so agreed to have that compassionate use treatment, and the pharmaceutical company did provide that to him. Unfortunately, it did not do what we hoped it would. But though those are examples of where that particular approach is used.
So it's not exactly a clinical trial then.
No.
Okay.
And they don't collect the data. Yeah, they don't collect data. It's not, it is individual for that particular patient situation. But that decision is based on clinical trial data that is available, if that makes sense.
Okay, so that's really helpful for patients to clarify that then. Thank you. That's really helpful.
And I would just add, it's almost like a special request to a pharmaceutical or a sponsor to actually receive this compound for this individual patient for this specific cancer or disease.
That's very, very, very helpful. And Wendy, I have a question for you. What happens when a patient outlives a trial?
What happens when a patient outlives a trial? So they will still be on treatment. And as a sponsor, there's an obligation to still treat that patient even after the trial ends, especially if they're responding to it.
Okay.
That's a great question.
That is a great question.
Yeah.
Yes, that was a question from so many people, and I loved that. Another question that we got, if you have had multiple cancers, which that's actually really common, are you excluded from clinical trials?
It depends on the trial.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. It depends on the trial. And I would just say this, talking about inclusion exclusion criteria, that's another reason why some trials are not as diverse, because some of the inclusion exclusion criteria are so strict and stringent that, some people just don't qualify, especially minorities. Or you can, like you said, you have multiple cancers, so you may be excluded. So there may not be many trials that, would include someone with multiple history of cancers.
So it really boils down to the terms and conditions.
Absolutely.
So another question that we got, if you are removed from a trial, which Marni talked about, what can happen after that? Are you still taken care of?
Absolutely. So if, and again, regardless of the reason that you would be removed from the trial, you are always going to receive the standard of care of therapy that you would receive whether you were on a trial or not. So, if you were receiving that experimental medication, then you are off that trial. You will then go to the next available treatment that you would normally receive, whether you had been on that trial or not. So you will always be cared for in that way. Now, the people who are caring for you may change, because there may be a doctor that was specific for that particular trial, or nurses or clinical trial coordinators. So the people caring for you could change, but you would still be cared for in exactly the same way, whether you had been in a trial or not.
That's really good to know, because you might think that you're going to continue on with the same care team.
Yeah, and I want to make a point that if you are removed from a trial, you don't have to be removed, but you can say you don't want to be in the trial anymore. I think sometimes when patients sign the consent, they're enrolled, they're being treated, they feel an obligation to stay in the trial, but you as a patient have the right to say, no more, I don't want to do this. What are my other options?
So I really like this next question. It's very philosophical, and I kind of want both of your takes on this. So if you're in an early trial and results are showing just great, isn't it the ethically and morally good thing that you just start giving all participants the treatment?
Mhm.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah,
And that
Marnie
doesn't,
covered this too. Yeah. Oh,
yeah.
sorry. Go ahead, Marnie. Yeah,
No, I'm
you covered
sorry,
this in
Wendy.
your you covered this in your presentation, where they would cross patients over. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a moral obligation and ethical
Mm-hmm.
obligation to do that, you know, especially if it's a therapy that is just really effective compared to what, you know, the other patients are
Mhm.
receiving. Then they are going to stop that trial early, and
Mm-hmm.
they are going to make that therapy available for everyone.
Yeah. Great question.
Yeah, a question we also get a lot in our support groups is clinicaltrials.gov is very difficult to navigate.
Yep.
I like Wendy's
Oh,
laugh.
yes.
I think everybody just laughed when I said that question. Um, is there hope maybe for a better way? I mean, I know that there's third party people trying things. Trican Health for pancreatic cancer is a great thing. It's I don't know. That's my question. Do you know of anything? Is it mostly just talking to your provider? I mean, how can do you know of a way that you can navigate that easier?
I would say no. There's no way to navigate it easier. I think it's really partnering with an advocate or an advocacy group who have the knowledge and can help you navigate that system. Because when you have a diagnosis of cancer, trying to consider a clinical trial, you get on clinicaltrials.gov and it's very frustrating, right? And then you're not
Yes.
motivated to do it anymore. So I think if you can, get in a group like ANCAN and have Rick or, another member of ANCAN help you navigate that or point you in the right direction or,
Hmm.
partner you with a cancer patient who is good at navigating clinical trials. I think that's probably the best way to go, opposed to being frustrated and losing your
Yes.
motivation to even inquire about the clinical trial.
Yeah, I'll just say too that look, as I mentioned, I was a clinical trials nurse. I have been working in oncology for over 25 years, and I can't use clinical trials.gov.
Mm-hmm,
It
mm-hmm.
is really difficult, and frankly, you know, even searching for trials yourself, and I mentioned this earlier, you know, it's by all means, you know, look for what's out there, but just always keep in mind that the best way to do this is to talk about those options with your physicians, because they know your individual situation. They know
Mm-hmm.
everything about you clinically, personally, and like we said, those eligibility criteria can be very complex. So
Hmm.
you may think, oh, wow, I meet all of these. This is great. But there's a lot more that's not listed on clinicaltrials.gov that you won't be aware of. So it's, you know, I wish there was an easy way to do this,
I
but
feel
there
like a
just,
lot of people feel seen right now. I really do. I mean,
yeah.
people, all of you people on the recording and live, you just heard a former clinical trials nurse coordinator say that. So just know that. So, and Dr. Wendy, I'm just saying, like, we can all just take a breath and feel much better. And that kind of leads
So
me to my next
wait, let me
question.
just say,
Oh, go ahead.
Alexa, really quick, before you go to that though, because I do want to give people a little bit of hope. In that I know that I know you've all been hearing about artificial intelligence, AI for everything. Okay.
Oh yeah.
I just used AI to create a new headshot. It's just unbelievable what you can do with AI these days. Okay, they are using, so at all of the medical conferences I've been to in the last year, AI is coming into healthcare like gangbusters. And one of the big things they're using AI for is for better clinical trial matching. And there are now companies fully dedicated to using AI to be able to identify more patients for these clinical trials based on all of their healthcare criteria that I was just talking about, and being able to then bring more clinical trials to more diverse populations. So it's a really exciting approach to this, and I'm very encouraged by this. So stay tuned. There may be some hope in the very near future.
You might come next year and give us an update. Like, stay tuned, everybody. But you were talking about, relying on your care team. And I kind of wanted to touch on, because we've seen this here. I kind of want you to explain what an academic conflict of interest is and how patients can protect themselves from that potentially.
You want to take that, Wendy? Or
so academic, you mean an institution having conflict of interest to run a trial?
Well, I guess, there's sometimes your provider can be the PI of a trial. And they can want you to go in that particular trial and tell you there's only one trial, and maybe not tell you of all your options.
So that's not ethical, first and foremost. And your doctor or oncologist should disclose that. And you always have options. And I would always say, if you hear about a clinical trial, someone approaches you about a clinical trial, you don't answer right then and there. Take that information with you, consult someone else before you actually make a decision. But that is unethical, and no provider should ever, strong arm a patient into a trial just because they're the PI. That should never happen. And if it is happening, we should talk.
Yes, thank you for saying that.
And the PI's name is written right on that informed consent form. So if your doctor is the PI, you will be well aware of that right off the bat. And I totally agree with Wendy that if you ask about clinical trials and your doctor says that there are no clinical trial options for you, or only has one clinical trial option for you, you do not have to be satisfied with that answer. I totally agree with Wendy. Yes. Talk to other doctors, talk to the nurses, talk to the clinical trial. You can actually just say, I would really like to speak to a clinical trial coordinator, and you should be able to speak to one. So, I definitely would never take, no, there are no options, off the bat, or there's only one option, that I would want to know why. And you would ask a lot more questions.
That's a great answer.
And to that point, I just want to say this. I know we're talking about advocacy and empowerment and speaking up. It's really important that you have a good relationship with your provider, that you feel comfortable. If you don't feel comfortable asking a question, we have to figure something out there, because you have to feel comfortable asking questions, pushing back, right, bringing things up. So I think it's important that you understand that you are in charge and they are working for you, and it's your life. It's your loved one's life. So you should feel comfortable in asking questions and definitely pushing back and taking all the time you need and not feeling rushed. Because I know just with healthcare, many things are rushed, but this is life we're talking about. So I just want to say that in terms of everything we're talking about, it's not as easy as we think it is.
And the question, we got a question, what if you're treated at a community hospital and they don't have a clinical trials nurse coordinator? Where could you go to?
Wendy, I'm going to let you take that first. And then
is this part of why we have the health disparities issue that we have?
Yes, it is. Yes.
It truly is. And I saw a question in the chat about clinical trials being run at a community. Oh, yeah, my connection. I'm sorry. Okay, can you hear me? Is it okay?
We can hear you
Yes.
great. No, you're good.
Okay. All right. I saw a question about trials being run at community sites, and I want you to know, as a sponsor or a pharmaceutical company, there's a process that goes into place to picking a site to make sure that they have the staff and the infrastructure to run the trial. To answer the question, if there is not a clinical trial coordinator there, you don't have to be on the trial there. The trial is run in various sites. The question is there one in your area? Are you willing to travel? But that's not the only site where you can actually be part of the trial. And if you recommend a coordinator and they don't have one, you ask the question. So how can you partner me with someone who can answer my questions? Or, help me explore other options.
That is that is just fantastic. I love that. And we need more of that too. Absolutely.
There are efforts to try to fix these situations, because there are many, as Wendy said, in order to run a clinical trial, you need to have the staff and the resources and the infrastructure to do that. And there's many community sites, clinics that don't have that. And so there are different clinical trials that they're trying to conduct now, specifically in the community, where there's where all of the data is being generated and sent to a central location that is not having to be managed at that particular community site where the patient's being treated. And they're trying to change those workflows and so forth to allow better access. But as far as I'm concerned, it's taken too long. And that is something that has bothered me for a long time, because this is particularly an issue for patients in rural communities. Okay. Like how are they supposed to get access to trials? Because as Wendy said, if you're willing to travel, well, if you're in a rural community and the closest site is 2 hours away, that's really difficult for people. So, they're trying to do things like mobile phlebotomy, where they send people to your house to draw blood, so that so they're coming up with solutions slowly but surely. But we need more, and we need them quicker.
Absolutely.
I know we're a little bit over time. Is it okay if we answer a couple more questions?
Yes.
I'm fine with that. Yes.
Okay. We had a question about, are doctors allowed to use treatments that are not FDA approved in clinical trials?
That are not.
You mean, are they allowed to prescribe them to patients if they haven't been approved through a trial? Is that what we're asking?
It seems that way, yes.
I think that gets back to the compassionate use question. Because as far as I'm concerned, that's the only way you can do that, is if you get compassionate use for a patient. But you cannot prescribe any therapy if it hasn't been approved through a trial. Unless, Wendy, you know of another way, that's the only way I know of that it can happen.
I do not.
Can I just say something on that one, just to clarify, if I may? Most often, but not always, clinical trials test drugs that have not yet been approved by the FDA. That's the whole purpose of clinical trials. Now, there are occasions when drugs that have already been approved may be tested either with a new drug or with another drug that's already been approved. There's a huge trial right now called TARPUR, TARPUR, which I think is an NCI, National Cancer Institute trial, with about 35 different arms, and they're just throwing all kinds of different drugs together to test certain mutations. And very often those two drugs put together for a particular mutation may already be approved, but they're not approved for FDA approved for the therapy, for the protocol. So they test those two drugs out, both FDA approved, and if they work, that then becomes a protocol. But in most instances, what you'll find in a clinical trial is that they're testing drugs that are not FDA drugs. That's the whole point of a clinical trial. Next question.
Yes, thank you. I have a very interesting question. If you are considering a clinical trial, can you talk to other participants who are already in the trial?
Huh. That is a fabulous question. And I don't see why you couldn't, except for the fact that you have to deal with patient confidentiality. So what I'm saying is that there is no reason why you couldn't speak to someone who is on a trial, but they would have to divulge that they are on that trial. So your doctor could not say, "Oh, I'm going to put you in contact with Mary Smith because she's on that trial," because he's not, or he or she is not allowed to tell you that another patient is being cared for on a trial. So if you meet individuals like in patient advocacy groups, for example, and you meet individuals who are on trials and you want to talk to them about that, absolutely. But unfortunately, healthcare providers can't introduce you to people on trials, because then that breaks confidentiality and they're providing information about a patient that they shouldn't be.
So it's complicated.
Yes.
So I'd like to jump in on that one, because I actually have a little bit of knowledge on this particular issue. And I want to give a shout out to my dear mentee, Danelle Lewis, who last year at the UPenn wrote her keystone thesis exactly on this issue.
Oh.
There are Facebook groups that come together over trials, and they're unofficial Facebook groups. So people on trials, if you look on Facebook and you put in your trial number, you may actually find other people who have gathered together. And the problem is that they compare notes. And what happens when they compare notes is they can unblind the trial. So by unblinding the trial, I mean they can figure out who's getting the drug and who is not getting the drug.
Oh my God.
And this is Wendy, I think I had Danelle call you last year, and she spoke to you when she was doing her research.
Yes.
Remember, we could not, we couldn't get enough of these people to respond to a survey. So she finished up doing in-depth interviews, and she wrote a great paper, and I can probably get copies of the paper for Marni and for Wendy to read. But it is a real issue for the pharmaceutical companies, because they don't want the patients getting together, because they don't want these trials unblinded, because it threatens the trials.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Wow. That is fascinating, Rick. I would love to see that paper, because wow. That is crazy.
Another shout out for Miss Danelle. It's her birthday today. So when I speak to her tomorrow, because I happened to speak to her yesterday, because she just got a job. So when I speak to her I'll write to her tomorrow, and I'll see if I can get her. I know her fiance is taking her out for dinner tonight, so she won't be watching.
I hope it's a very good dinner. How about that?
Okay. What else you got?
Okay, so I have a question, very interesting question. Is anything being done about the fact that pharmaceutical companies are frequently still not posting negative trial results to clinicaltrials.gov?
Hmm.
This question comes
Yeah.
from one of our highbrow brains trust advocates, and we've stumped him, boy. We've stumped Marnie
Well,
and Wendy.
because I was going to say, first of all, and this drives me crazy, but I will tell you that clinicaltrials.gov in general, it's terrible how long it takes to post the data on that site, regardless if it's positive or negative, to be quite honest with you. Now, I was under the impression that, again, whether it was a positive or a negative trial, that data is published. But I don't know if, Wendy, do you know if that is absolutely required or not?
I think it is. I'm thinking the CSR is still pretty good. I think they have to. But I'm
Okay,
just saying,
that's
I don't,
what I
I think,
thought.
I think it's published, but I don't think it's marketed or advertised, right?
Right, right.
So
Yes.
it, yeah, I think they have to. I think they have to publish it because then another pharmaceutical company could not replicate that trial. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So
Yes.
they would have to publish it. The question is, where is it published?
Yes. Good point.
So we'll have to follow up with our man here and find out whether it is in fact a fact that pharma companies are frequently still not posting. I think what's happening is exactly what Marnie said. It isn't so much that they're not posting the negative results, they're not posting any results. And
Mm-hmm.
that's the problem, isn't it, Marnie?
Yeah, it drives me crazy, honestly.
So I also have a question. Does being part of a clinical trial limit your future clinical trial options or your future treatment options?
You know, again, that can depend completely on the eligibility criteria for the study.
I think
It's not
the heart
necessarily
of the question is if you get on a clinical trial, are you out of options after? Like, is that it? Or is there no more options after that?
Oh,
Okay.
that's a good one.
no. Yeah, and just because you're on a clinical trial, that doesn't mean you can't go on another clinical trial
Okay.
if
Yes,
you're
I think that's
eligible.
part of the
Right.
question. Mm-hmm.
Right. So as
Right.
long as you're eligible, then you can go on that a second. You can go on a third clinical trial. You know, you just have to meet the eligibility criteria. It's just that, excuse me, the more treatments that you receive, it could limit the clinical trial options to you down the line, because there's many clinical trials that state, they can't have had received any treatment for metastatic cancer to be part of the trial, or they can't have received these particular therapies in order to be eligible. So, but you can go on as many clinical trials as you want as long as you meet the eligibility criteria.
Yeah, and I just want to add that I think it's important for the audience to know that a clinical trial can be, it should be an option for newly diagnosed cancers because to Marnie's point, the placebo, you're still getting standard of care. So because there are a lot of trials that are looking at newly diagnosed prostate, lung, ovarian, breast. So I think it's important to know that because the perception is that clinical trials is like the last resort, and that is incorrect.
Yes, we hear that all the time.
So here's a great question. You're considering a clinical trial and you ask the trial coordinator or your doc or your PI, how's the trial going? What are the results to date? what sort of answers are you going to get? What are they likely to tell you? Can that be revealed when you're considering signing up?
No, absolutely not.
Okay.
And the reason I can tell you that with 100% confidence is
Yes.
that, I work for a company. and any company that you work for, you have to have complete confidentiality of any data on any trial. And so does anyone working on that trial, to the point that you will not know the full data until it is presented at a conference. And so you will often see, if it's a trial that's very positive and very exciting, that you will see a simultaneous publication of the results
Mhm.
and a presentation of the data at the exact same time at a conference. So that goes, and they will say that's why they do not release abstracts for conferences and so forth until right before the conference. This is all to keep the data confidential. So, it's, and part of this too is that until you look at all of the final data, you cannot draw any conclusions
Mhm.
until everything has been fully analyzed, in order to be able to say if something's safe or not, if something's effective or not. So you will never be able to know any data until that trial reports out.
Yeah, I think it's important also. I love this question, to let your oncologist or hematologist know that you're interested, and ask them, are they going to the conference? And if anything is presented, you would like to know if they're going to ASH or ASCO, if they're going to these big conferences, what was presented. Show an interest, and that's also a way to develop a relationship, because they know that you're interested in what's going on. So they may come back and say, well, it was an interim analysis, or this was presented, or whatever. So I think that's a great question, and everyone's in their right to ask that question to their provider.
I love that, Wendy. As a matter of fact, there are many patients that go to these conferences
Oh,
to
yes.
hear about this
Yes.
data. And
Mhm.
I love that too, because if you want to know the latest data, those conferences are where you're going to find that out. So absolutely ask questions, talk to your doctors, and find out as much as you can.
And a lot of
Another
our moderators in our groups, they go to the conferences and they report back. Like our prostate group, high risk advanced, they do the ASCO reports, and then our blood cancer groups do the ASH reports. So
Oh, that's
all that
great.
stuff helps.
here's another beauty for you that you will enjoy answering, which is um how what is your advice to patients on whether they should participate in a phase 1 or phase 2, or should they wait until they know it's safe and then when it's a phase 3? I've got we've got a gent asking in here about, safety of the early trials and what should I do? What do you say to people? Because both you and Wendy have had to talk to people who are looking at phase 1s and phase 2s, and they don't want to turn purple or green or something.
I mean, I'll say from the perspective, so I mentioned earlier that the more therapies you receive, you are going to be less eligible for several trials, right? And that's precisely the reason why phase 1 trials are typically patients who have had a lot of different therapies,
Mhm.
and don't have a lot of options
Mhm.
left, because the eligibility criteria typically will allow for a lot of prior treatments, because what they're looking for that phase 1 is the primary goal is safety.
Mhm.
And so, that typically is patients who have really been through a lot of different treatments prior to that. Phase 2, they've already answered the major safety issues, but of course, they're still monitoring safety. And as I said, in a phase 2 trial, they can even do an accelerated approval by the FDA because a therapy is shown to be effective, particularly in groups of patients that don't have a lot of treatment options. So phase 2 trials can be very popular because they're looking for efficacy in those trials. So I'm never going, it's you can never say that there isn't major risks in a phase 1 and phase 2 trial, because of course we know that there are. And if you wait for the phase 3 trial, you don't even know if you'll be eligible at that point. So that's another thing to consider. Wendy, what
Yeah,
do you think?
I think you covered it. It's an option. It's an option. That's what I would say. And it's an option you can consider, opposed to there being nothing. So
I think we've got 2 questions left to answer, and then we'll call it a night. Alexa, we've got the very first question from one of our blood moderators, which is a thoughtful question. And it's a very simple question. 4 words. Who designs clinical trials?
I have.
yeah.
You're looking at
Honestly,
them.
anybody,
Mhm.
a scientist, clinical researchers, physicians, nurses,
Mhm.
anyone who is involved in healthcare and science that has expertise in those areas can write and develop a clinical trial. In order to conduct that clinical trial, however, you need to have funding. And so that's where a lot of stickiness comes into play. And remember, I said that any trial that is developed or written, it needs to be, it goes through an approval process. It goes, we have to make sure that the way that it's written, that it's ethical, that patient safety is number one. But there are a lot of different people who can be involved in writing a protocol.
Yeah, and I want to say this. I know there are many pharmaceutical companies that are also bringing patients and care partners to the table to help with that process, because your voice matters. So not all of them, but some of them are. And I think that's where you can advocate, right? You can advocate for this would work, this wouldn't work. And I know for me, when I was working in the pharmaceutical industry, we did a lot of focus groups with protocols to get the patient's insight. Should we do this? Should we not do this? And really taking that insight and thinking about it and seeing where we can make some shifts and pivots to make the trial that much more robust. So you can definitely be a part of that process of writing a quote unquote protocol.
We've been involved, I think,
Yes.
with Pfizer and with Janssen, where they've sought our advice on designing clinical trials. One of the things that we mentioned, and I learned through this, is that you have to make sure your clinical trial agrees to continue to provide you medicine if the trial is stopped. So if you're on that trial and you've responded well, but overall the trial is failing, then you want to be sure that you can still get that trial medicine when they close the trial. And sometimes, I mean, believe it or not, the pharmaceutical companies don't always think of that. And so we as advocates, advocate for people who are going to go on that trial to make sure that happens. Have you
That's a
seen
great
that?
point, Rick.
Yeah. You got any more, or are we done, Alexa?
Now we have one more question. Can a trial change in the middle of it?
Yes, absolutely. Protocol amendment.
What is that?
Oh, the bane of any researchers' existence.
So when we put on the flyer that you're going to get the inside scoop, we are going deeper than even I expected. So
Yeah, no, Wendy, I'm glad you said that. That's like it is. It's amendments are there are many amendments that can happen in a trial where and that's why I said before that there are committees like the data safety monitoring committees, right? So they're there to make sure that the trial is being conducted well and safely. So if they find during the conduct of the trial that a particular blood draw is needed in order to ensure that we're making sure that patients aren't having effects to their liver, then they're going to do an amendment to the protocol and they're going to add that blood draw, for example. Wendy, do you have a better example of that?
Maybe for safety reasons, if and this is why I think it's important for patients to report if they're experiencing any adverse effect, whether it's minor or even major, because that can be, a catalyst for a protocol amendment where we're implementing maybe a different pre-med or a different prophylactic med to prevent whatever is being reported. So, what you report is very key, but yes, trials. There are protocol amendments in the middle of a trial, and it's usually for safety. So yes, to answer the question, yes, yes. And
so that's
patients play
actually
a
a
pivotal
relief.
role in that. Yes.
That's a good
Yeah,
thing.
and I mean, we saw something recently. We were looking at a prostate cancer trial for a androgen receptor destroyer type of drug, and the protocol on clinicaltrials.gov was totally unrelated to what the current protocol of that trial was. They had changed the protocol. They had never updated their clinicaltrials.gov website, and the eligibility and the requirements were frankly completely different. We found this out because we had, I think, 3 or 4 different people who were trying to get into that trial. So we saw what the current requirements were. And that's a real problem. As patients, I find that that's a real problem.
Rick, I'm surprised to hear that because at least when I was doing clinical trials, a lot of times, especially if there's any major changes to, with an amendment, that you have to reconsent patients and have them re-sign a consent because you have to make them aware of the change. So I find that very surprising that there would be changes that nobody's aware of.
Well, when you say nobody's aware of, the company was aware of it, and any patient who was trying to get into that trial because it was a highly sought after, oversubscribed trial found out about it. But when you looked at that trial on clinicaltrials.gov, it just hadn't been
Oh,
updated.
yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Clinicaltrials.gov. Yeah.
Do,
Back
do
to your
you
point,
follow what
Marna,
I'm
things not
saying?
being updated. Yeah.
Back to the clinicaltrials.gov.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, it was all above board, but the only people who knew were the people who were actually being being recruited and reading the current disclosures.
Yeah.
So, you know,
But I'm
so
glad that question was asked though, because it's a good point to say that if a trial is changed and there is an amendment, that you will, like, if you are currently on that trial, you will be made aware of the change. And oftentimes they will have you sign a new consent form so that to make sure that you are aware that that change has happened.
Okay. In this instance, I think it was more about the eligibility and who they were. Listen, I can hear. We got to stop. The dogs need to go out.
Oh my God.
Yes.
So
Yeah, this
sorry.
is a great, this is a fantastic segue.
I knew that was going to happen at some point.
I love it. I love
I
Marnie's dogs. Every time I meet with her, I talk about them. So I love Marnie's dogs. I hope that you learned so much from this presentation and that you
hold on a
learned.
minute. Hold on 1 second. Hold on 1 second before I just want to, we gave a shout out to the dogs. I just want to give a shout out to Dr. Wendy that my favorite junior, Claude, has not interrupted the webinar. God bless him. we love
Thank
Claude
you,
at
Rick.
ANCAN. Go ahead.
And shout out to Claude. We're having a very fun night tonight talking about clinical trials. I hope that you really enjoyed this webinar and that you learned a lot and that you learned more how to be your own best advocate. We might have to come back and do this, rag more on clinicaltrials.gov. As you saw, Marnie and Wendy, they're just so incredible. And thank you guys so much for coming. There will be a survey after this that you will get, and you will get a link to the recording. Thank you guys so much. And I really encourage you to bring these questions and discussions to our groups as well. As Wendy said, who's a great advocate for our groups, we really are here to help and support you. So please stop by. And yes, thank you so much for coming. And yes, we'll see you soon. Good night, everybody.
Ladies.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.